Over the last 6 months, Nintendo has been extremely good about adding classic games to their online service. From high-profile first-person shooters, to cult classic role-playing games, to some of Rare's greatest hits. Subscribers to both the Nintendo Switch Online and Expansion Pack have had a lot to be excited about in 2024. But how does this year compare to last year? Are things headed in the right direction, or are there signs of danger for the 7-year-old service? Now that we're exactly halfway through the year, it's time to take a step back and assess just how things are going for the Nintendo Switch Online. I sure hope you like charts, because we're about to dive into a world full of numbers and stats when we take a look back at the Nintendo Switch Online mid-year report card. As the world gathered around to ring in the new year, there was some real pessimism in the air about what to expect out of 2024. That was especially true when we're talking about the Nintendo Switch Online. After all, we were coming off of a banner year that was not only full of high-profile releases like GoldenEye 007, Metroid Fusion, and Street Fighter II, but also introduced the Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance into the mix. With everybody expecting Nintendo to release their Switch follow-up in 2024, many wondered just how much juice their online service could possibly have left in it. I mean, would it surprise anybody if Nintendo only released a handful of titles as the Switch's life came to its inevitable conclusion? Many speculated that Nintendo could just hit the reset button when it came to their next console. Of course, this isn't what happened. Nintendo ended up delaying their Switch successor until sometime in 2025, and instead of quietly abandoning the system like they've done so many times in the past, Nintendo has made the bold decision to actually support their mega successful console right through to the bitter end. And yes, that also includes the Nintendo Switch Online Classic Game Library. When we look at the last 6 months, we see a surprisingly diverse selection of games that scratch pretty much every itch that you could possibly have, including role-playing games, classic shoot-'em-ups, sports, racing, fighting games, hidden gems, and whatever genre blastcore is. And let me tell you, if you're a fan of Mega Man and don't mind black and white graphics, then this was the year for you. In the first half of 2024, Nintendo released a total of 28 games across 6 different consoles. Now that's not including the 7 Nintendo Entertainment System games that were just released over Independence Day weekend. We'll talk about those games later in this episode. Now if you're just looking at the chart, yes, 28 is down from last year. But you have to remember that 2023 was front-loaded. Nintendo added 3 retro consoles to the first half of the year, which accounts for 24 of the 38 releases between January and June. That's 63% of the releases dominated by just Game Boy titles. In contrast, we haven't seen any new system added in 2024, and we likely won't. In reality, the fairer comparison is probably 2022, which didn't see any additional consoles added to the service. That first half of the year saw 24 games added to the library, which is extremely close to what we have here in 2024. And we're not just beating 2022, by the way, we're also beating every other year on record. Even if you combine the 7 and the 9 games released in the first half of 2020 and 2021, we still only get to 16. We basically need to add the 14 games from 2019 just to beat the 28 games that were released this year. And really, that's just barely getting us over that line. The point is, things are really looking good in 2024. But what about the games? I mean, the amount of games released in the first half of the year means nothing if they're all clunkers. Nobody wants a library of just terrible games. Thankfully, that's not been a problem in 2024. Now, while we could argue about the quality of Alleyway or Dr. Mario, I think it's safe to say that the first half of this year featured a bunch of big releases and well-reviewed fan favorites. This is, after all, the year that brought us both of the Golden Sun games, a nice selection of Rare's greatest hits, and Nintendo 64 classics like Extreme G and Turok. There were also some lesser-known cult classics that made the cut, including The Amazing Haberike, Iggy's Wrecking Balls, Blast Corps, Snake, Rattle, and Roll, and even a Wrecking Crew sequel that most of you probably never even heard of. This has been a stacked year. And best of all, you don't even have to take my word for it because we have numbers to back it up. When we average the 28 games that have been released in 2024, we find an average score of 81%. That's really good. Yes, 2023 is a little better, coming in with an average of 84%. But again, with the launch of 3 different Game Boy systems, they front-loaded it with most of their best games. The fact that it's even this close is honestly a little surprising. As you can see, it's common to have a much, much lower average, like the 75% in 2022, or the 65% in 2021. Well, on the topic of reviews, the top scoring game released on the Nintendo Switch Online this year is The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past with 4 Swords, which earned a staggering 97%. It's followed closely by Perfect Dark with a 93% average, Metroid Zero Mission with a 91%, and then Golden Sun, Snake Rattle and Roll, Mario Golf, and Mario Tennis all tying with an 89%. Now, on the opposite of that scale, we have Alleyway as the lowest scoring game released this year, with an average score of just 37%. Honestly, that one's really a bit of an outlier, as the second worst reviewed score is almost 30 points higher, with Iggy's Wrecking Balls scoring a 64%. Baseball on the Game Boy comes in with a 69%, nice. And then Dr. Mario and Mega Man 5 round out the bottom with 72% and 77%. Look, when Mega Man 5 is one of the worst reviewed games with a 77%, I think it's fair to say that it's been a pretty good year. So, what does all this mean for the future? We got 28 games released in just the first half of this year, so does that mean that we'll see 56 releases in 2024? That number would actually top last year's total, which was 55, and it would be the most games added to the Nintendo Switch Online in a year since the inception in 2018. What's crazy about 2023, though, is that a full 69% of the games that were released that year came between January and June. You saw something similar happen in 2022, when 62% of the games were released in the first half of the year. If that holds true for 2024, then we might only top out at like 35 games. Perhaps we get up to 39, just like 2022. But hold on, let's not get ahead of ourselves. While 2022 and 2023 were certainly front-loaded, there's just as much of a chance, maybe even more of a chance, that the exact opposite will happen this year. After all, Nintendo just added 7 more games in July, which is a great way to start the second half of the year. 2019 through 2021 were all backloaded. You can see that only 31% of the games released in 2019 are from the first half, while that's 35% in 2020 and only 22% in 2021. Although it is important to keep in mind that the back half of 21 is when they released the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack, which added the Nintendo 64 and the Genesis. So there's a reason there. Speaking of which, where the hell is the Genesis? As of today, we've officially gone 373 days without a single Genesis game added to the library. That's more than a full year. In that time, we've seen the Super Nintendo and both the Game Boy Color and Advance receive 6 games each, with the OG Game Boy getting 10, the Nintendo 64 picking up 11, and believe it or not, the Nintendo Entertainment System getting the most with 15. The problem isn't that Nintendo is simply forgetting about some of their older systems now that the Game Boy lineup is here, but rather that Nintendo only forgot about the Genesis. Honestly, that's super disappointing because there are literally dozens of high-profile Genesis games that will probably never find their way to the Switch now. The whole thing is just a massive missed opportunity that's been handled wrong right from the very beginning. Here's the system breakdown for the first half of 2024. Again, this does not include the 7 NES games that were added in July. As you can see here, the Game Boy is way out in the lead with 9 games released between January and June. The dominance grows even stronger if you include the 2 Game Boy Color releases. In second place is a 3-way tie between the Nintendo 64, the Super NES, and the Game Boy Advance, each getting 5 games. And then, the Nintendo Entertainment System comes in last with only 2 games, which means that 18 of the games added in the first half of this year are for the standard version of the Nintendo Switch Online, and 10 of them are for the expansion pack. The good news is that the first half of 2024 has set up a lot of exciting scenarios for the rest of the year. Right off the bat, we saw a big push for adding Rare's classic games to the library, including Battletoads and Killer Instinct on the Super NES. This was reinforced only a few weeks ago with Nintendo adding another Rare classic, Perfect Dark. There really are a staggering amount of 8, 16, and even 64-bit games from Rare that I have to imagine we're going to be seeing on the Nintendo Switch Online at some point in the near future. I'm talking about Battletoad games on both the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Game Boy. There's also the entire Wizards and Warriors series, and maybe even Killer Instinct Gold on the Nintendo 64. All of these games feel like they could be announced just any day now. It's also worth mentioning that Rare also has a certain cult classic in their back pocket that everybody's been buzzing about. That's right, I'm of course talking about Conker's Bad Fur Day. You know what, that also brings us to another big change to the Nintendo Switch Online that could potentially be a big deal going forward. I'm talking about the fact that Nintendo added a mature section to the Nintendo 64 side of the app. Something that could open up a whole floodgate with a bunch of classic first-person shooters, a bunch of Mortal Kombat games, South Park, and even War Gods. And yes, it also paves the way for a possible re-release of Conker's Bad Fur Day, a game that Nintendo infamously refused to publish back in the day. Alright, look, I can see this happening. Nintendo has been known for having surprise announcements with high-profile games during the holiday season. So if Conker finds his way home in November or December, I honestly won't be that surprised. That said, I do feel like there are just a whole lot more M-rated titles that are a lot more likely to get added to the expansion pack library. For example, I have to bet that we see Doom 64 and those Quake games, possibly even Hexen. Those all fall into the Xbox Game Studios camp, much like Perfect Dark. I'm also fairly confident that at least 1 or 2 of the Turok sequels will be announced in the near future. Those are published by Night Dive, so perhaps we'll also see Shadow Man make its way to the Switch library. And while it's not M-rated, I have to imagine that we'll also get Extreme G2 at some point in the near future, seeing as we got the first installment earlier in the year. What we probably won't get are the South Park games or ECW Hardcore Revolution, obviously due to the licensing issues. I also have a hunch that Daikatana, BioFreaks, and of course War Gods will also stay buried. And speaking of Midway 64-bit games, I wouldn't hold my breath for Mortal Kombat, as Warner Bros. Has shown no interest in featuring their classic games on the Nintendo Switch Online. But what about Resident Evil 2, you might ask? On one hand, Capcom has been part of the Nintendo Switch Online from the start. And even better, they just recently released 5 different Mega Man games. Now, that's all positive news, but the other thing you have to keep in mind about Capcom's selection of releases is it's really spotty. They've withheld a lot of their biggest titles, often because they'd rather sell you them in a game compilation. For example, the 5 Mega Man games that were released on the Nintendo Switch Online are not part of either of the Mega Man Legacy collections, which may explain why they added those to the mix and not their more famous console counterparts. Now ask yourself, does Capcom really want you to get Resident Evil 2 for free when they can sell it to you as a remake? I hate to say it, but for that reason, I'm dubious we'll see Leon, Claire, and the rest of the Resident Evil 2 cast on the Nintendo Switch Online. And you know, that really is the thing about the service that's working against it going into the second half of 2024. Now that Nintendo has managed to release most of their biggest hits across multiple platforms, we're starting to see a bunch of holes left by the companies that would rather sell you compilations than participate in a subscription service. Nowhere is this more glaring than Square and Enix, or Square Enix, both of which publish some of the best games of the 8 and 16-bit generations, yet aren't nowhere to be found on the Nintendo Switch Online. If you want to play those classic Final Fantasy games, then you're gonna have to buy that Pixel Remaster set. The same can be said about Dragon Quest, or Dragon Warrior as it was called here in the US. Those first few games would have been a perfect part of the Switch library, but fans will need to wait for the 2D HD remakes to scratch that particular itch. The good news is that there is still a lot of great first and third party games that are just waiting in the wings, especially on the Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, and yes, even the Genesis. If we just look at the first party Nintendo games, there's Kirby, Nightmare and Dreamland, Wario Land 4, Mario Golf Advance Tour, and Mario and Donkey Kong on the Game Boy Advance. Speaking of Donkey Kong, it wouldn't surprise me to see that 1994 Game Boy game get added to the library, as well as Donkey Kong 64 and Diddy Kong Racing on the Nintendo 64. I'd also point to some obvious titles like Super Smash Bros. And a whole bunch of classic Pokemon games. And since we've already spent so much time talking about Rare, perhaps they could add the portable versions of Conker's Pocket Tales, Perfect Dark, and Killer Instinct. Okay, maybe not that last one. Nobody wants to play the Game Boy version of Killer Instinct. What I'd like to see Nintendo do this year is really shore up those third-party classics. We've already talked about Capcom and Square Enix, but somebody seriously needs to give Konami a good shake and see if they could get games like Operation C, or maybe even one of those Castlevania games from the Nintendo 64 on the service. Between Rare, Konami, and Capcom, there are just so many great games that rarely get added to compilations. I mean, the fact that we're this many years into the Nintendo Switch Online and Codename Viper or Mighty Final Fight hasn't been ported is an actual crime. How has this not happened yet? The point I'm trying to make is that the future actually looks really bright for the Nintendo Switch Online and the optional expansion pack. Yeah, the numbers are down slightly from last year, but I suspect they'll more or less even things out by the time we ring in 2025. Especially if the 7 games that were just added in July are any indication. So I say bring on the rare games, bring on the mature games, and of course bring on the big surprises that nobody is expecting. If the back half of this year is anything as good as the first 6 months, then we're in for one hell of a ride in 2024, and honestly, I can't wait. Hey, thanks for watching me break down the Nintendo Switch Online numbers and charts. We're already off to a great start for the second half of the year. So, if you enjoy these types of shows about Nintendo Switch Online, make sure and check out the full playlist where we see what the critics said back in the day about every single game on the online service. All of them. Now, here's the question I have for you. How would you rate the first half of 2024? Also, how many games do you think we'll see at the end of the year? What are your Nintendo Switch Online predictions? Will we beat last year? Let me see your thoughts in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a review and talk about Blood, Captain Blood. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,